Welcome, Wargamers. Today we are diving into one of the most exciting topics of lore in the Mortal Realms, and that is the man himself, Nagash. I wanted to take a break from just doing faction reviews, where we talk about an entire people group and focus on some of the key characters that make this lore so interesting. Now, when we're talking characters, of course, obviously there's Sigmar is a big one, but he doesn't have, a cool model to show off while I do these kinds of things. And also his lore is not nearly as full in the background. Nagash has a fascinating life, and so we're going to dive into that. Now, as always, if you have topics that you want discussed, click subscribe, leave them in the comments down below. I read every single one of your comments. I use so many of them for inspiration. I try to respond to as many as possible, but as obviously there's a lot of you. I try my hardest. We're going to get through these, and everyone will get their questions answered. Now, I did take the feedback of many of you during the last lore video I did, where I kind of mixed it up and kind of focused on more what makes a character or a faction interesting rather than just straight facts. And kind of the format that I wanted to do this one, kind of tweaking a little bit, is have the facts up front and then towards the end talk about why that character is interesting. So that's what we're going to do this time. The basic format here is I'm going to tell you about the lore that we have from the old world, where he is now in the Mortal Realms, and then ending it with why he matters. So let's dig into facts that we have from the old world. This is like the old Warhammer books for fantasy back in the day. And I'm going to be honest with you, I'm going to cover these with broad strokes. Nagash has risen and then been slayed and risen and slayed, like I think 3 times now. So we're going to kind of skip a few of them because they're just kind of like, it seems like the authors just needed a villain, and so they just kind of picked him, resurrected him, and killed him again, so kind of anticlimactic. But we're going to start with his actual life as a human, because he did start as a human, and bring him up to the end times, and then where he sits now in Age of Sigmar. Okay, so to do this, we're going to travel back in time. Not just to the world that was, but even before the time period then. Okay, we're talking thousands of years before Warhammer Fantasy Battles takes place. This is an ancient civilization called Khemri, the Khemri Empire, and it's made up of what basically is the same aesthetically as our real-world Egyptians. And it has dynasties and things like that, things that are very relevant. Warhammer Fantasy Battles borrowed a lot of its, quote-unquote fiction from reality. And at one point in Khemri, there was a king, and he had 2 sons. The first one was named Nagash, who was incredibly sharp, very ambitious and intelligent. And he had a second one whose name escapes me, but he doesn't matter, and we'll get to why in a little bit. Now, important to know that in this Khemri society, if a king has a firstborn son, this son has to be the high priest. He can't be the king, he has to be the priest. And this is just kind of an ancient tradition that they had. When you are the priest, you are put in charge of something called the mortuary cult. This is basically a very rudimentary early death magic. It's not just death, it's also life, like preservation things, ways to keep souls attached to bodies, the bodies rot, like those kinds of things. More like mystical mummification, not quite evil, not quite dark, not really necromancy, but somewhere in that region. Well, Nagash, being as smart as he was, he took to this kind of magic and ritual stuff like a fish to water. He just figured it out really quick, became instantly just the leader of it. I mean, not just the positional leader as the king's son, but also like a dynamic thinker in this type of magic. And his power really grew. He was charismatic. He got a bunch of the other mortuary cults from around the empire together, and they're all behind him. And then eventually he got jealous of his brother, who, like we said earlier, your firstborn becomes the high priest, your second son, if you have one, becomes the king. So he wanted to be the king. And it's here that we start to see Nagash, even as a human way back in the day, this kind of like insatiable need for power and control. So one night he kills his brother. Like I said, I'm doing very broad strokes here. Kills his brother and asserts himself as king. Nobody questions him, because now you have someone who is not only the priest but the king. And so you have your first in this dynasty kind of god-king person. Now here's the thing. Once you have all the power, you can direct where the resources go. So Nagash, obviously, seeing his talents in this kind of mortuary cult, death magic stuff, is exceeding others, he devotes all resources to studying it. And this is where he kind of crosses that line from what used to be called mortuary cult to full-blown necromancy, the study of the reanimation of the dead, control over the undead, and that kind of stuff. And he has some major progresses that no one else can recreate. By that I mean he built a huge black pyramid, okay, like just this colossal monolithic thing. And basically what it is it channels all of the death magic on the old world into it. It's super nuts. So now you get this ambitious guy who is one of the founders of necromancy, who's channeling death magic into himself into his hands. He goes ahead and writes what's called the 9 Books of Nagash, which basically just chronicle all of his research, all of his spells, things like that. He kind of imbues it with himself, his power. And the last kind of thing I want to touch on, and this is super important, he creates a potion, I guess you would call it, maybe a draught, I don't know, called the Elixir of Life. And this basically grants immortality. He gives it to all of his lieutenants, and so he has this little cohort of immortals around him. It's important to note that one of those is a little fellow named Archaon, who you may know from the Mortarch model kit. Now here's the thing, you have this society that has a great reverence for the dead, just like I said, Khemri is very much based off of ancient Egypt in real world stuff. Great reverence for the dead, great reverence for all of these things. And now they're seeing their leader kind of go into necromantic stuff, which is just such an affront. So the other priests, the other mortuary cult people from kind of outlying regions of his empire start to kind of conspire. They start kind of not reanimating in the necromancy sense, but in the Tomb King sense of you can call forth old heroes. They still have their full independent mental faculties, but they're just back to life. They're kind of like zombies, kind of like skeletons, but they are themselves. There's no control over them. They start resurrecting all of their dead heroes and like that, and they lead a huge army against Nagash. And this is where they see the true horror of what's happening. You see, Nagash fights back, but he does so with an army of the actual dead. This has never been done in the history of the old world before, where someone has just independently exerted their will over dead corpses to reanimate them. So this is the first time people are seeing just how far down the road this thing has gone. Nagash is an incredibly powerful wizard. Like I said, he's channeling all kinds of death magic. He has this huge army. It's an epic battle. Ultimately, though, he does lose. And of course, before he gets killed and that, he makes a great escape thanks to Archaon defending him, and Nagash kind of goes into hiding. Now, if you have the old Nagash books, this is actually where I think things get really interesting. You see, Nagash is gone. He's been outcast. His, leaders and stuff like that have been dispatched, taken care of. Tranquility is starting to go back over Khemri. They have a great leader who's next, took his place. And so, but all the forces that went against Nagash, they're depleted. So they're they're really tired. Need to chance to re-up their forces and kind of build their strength back up. And then there's this one city in the whole region that sees an opportunity. And that's the city of Lamia. Lamia sees my fellow brothers in this empire, because they're a part of it, are really, really weakened. So the queen's name is Neferata, if you're familiar with that, basically sends a few troops into the main city, steals one of the books of Nagash, and brings it back. Now here's the thing, the mortuary cult and necromancers in Lamia are no slouches. They're not bad at what they do, but they're not nearly as good as Nagash. They try to create the Elixir of Life so that Neferata can have a never-ending reign, but they absolutely biff it. They make a terrible version of the thing. And what it winds up doing is creating an entire new race. She takes the elixir, and it's true, she gets unending life, totally immortal. Also, backfires because now she craves human blood. And with that, Nagash accidentally created the first vampires. So let's just pause here and think about this. He's already kind of delving into necromancy. He has been the first to rise an army of the undead, and through actions of his own in his research, and then also obviously the actions of Neferata, has created vampires, or as we would know them now, soulblight. But here's the thing I didn't see coming. Seeing as how they took part of the magic from Nagash with his book, he actually has control over them, though they don't initially realize it. So the state of affairs now is that Khemri has a new king. Nagash comes out of his exile, essentially, through machinations, gets in there and locks the king inside of a prison and begins to do a mega spell. Again, remember the huge black pyramid that's channeling all the death magic, and here was the plan, I think, okay? The plan was kill everything around me, resurrect it, and now I have full control, okay? And I think that was obviously, clearly the plan. And the punishment for the new king taking his place was you're going to watch all this happen. Well, during the spell, which is very complicated and convoluted, this guy breaks out of his jail cell, runs up, and kills Nagash during the spell. Now here's the thing, he killed him at the wrong time. What happens was everything was dead, all life, even plant life, everything is just gone. The entire area is just scoured and turned to a desert. Everyone's killed, but what happens is everyone gets resurrected. It's just not under Nagash's control. And this is how you have the Tomb Kings being born. Which is kind of crazy. With Nagash's death, because he didn't have a chance to exert his control over them, you just have an entire race of resurrected dead people. And Nagash lays on the ground. Now here's the thing. Nagash was smart, and he put kind of his essence, his soul, his power within a collection of artifacts, including the 9 books of Nagash, but not only them. There's like a sword, a crown, I think a staff, something like that. A few artifacts that, when you put them together, you are able to resurrect him. And this is where I'm going to kind of brief over a few things, because he is resurrected, struck down, resurrected, struck down, I think 2 additional times, if I'm not mistaken. If you know, leave in the comments down below, but yeah, it happens a few times. He's a really great villain in this storyline, so I think they just wanted to keep using that one. But we're going to fast forward to the end times. This is when the old world was kind of crumbling and Age of Sigmar was about ready to be born and launched. He's brought back. He is brought back by Archaon, Neferata, and Manfred, amongst others, which is interesting because those are the 3 Mortarchs that you can get in the set. He basically becomes the Black Pyramid that he created earlier. He's able to siphon it straight into his being rather than just like taking it off the pyramid. So in this sense, he basically becomes the focal point of all death magic. And in the end times, he has a great set of stories about him basically going back to Khemri, reclaiming his throne, absorbing the Tomb Kings into his army, so now he has an even bigger undead army. Just tons of power, a lot of machinations, all the things that make Nagash really great. Now, obviously the world ends, and there's a lot of lore and stuff like that you can find online about that. What I want to point out here, though, when we're talking about the kind of pre-history of Nagash, things that are interesting is that he is as old as Archaon, which you wouldn't think by, it always seems so subsidiary, but really Nagash is in charge, but Archaon is just as old as him if we take the lore to be canon. And also Neferata is probably only 100 years younger than him, which in the grand scheme of how much time these all have been alive is not a lot at all. Manfred's fairly young, he's several thousand years younger, but yeah, Neferata and Archaon not at all. This also illustrates that he is incredibly hard to destroy. Like I'm saying, he is the Lord of Death. He no longer can be killed. They make that very clear in the lore now, that he can't truly be killed, but he can be struck down to where he needs a lot of time to recuperate. And with that done, I want to bring us into the Age of Sigmar, what he's been doing since the Age of Sigmar started, and where he is now. Well, in the Age of Myth, when Sigmar and all the other gods were chilling and were getting along and things were great, he was part of the pantheon of good guys. But he desires power and control over all things. So over time, we don't know how much time, but I would assume quite a long time, his patience began to wane, and then he looked for a way to kind of usurp Sigmar. Now at this point, chaos started to poke its holes into the mortal realms again, and while they were being dealt with, things were getting a little more serious, a little more intense. And the Chaos Gods were looking for a way to get in. And this happened at a kind of pivotal moment. Details are fuzzy. I really hope that they go backwards in time and talk about it. But Nagash essentially lets chaos in, dealing what is essentially the biggest betrayal to the pantheon of gods that you can imagine. And I think his motivation was, he's so self-confident and arrogant. He thinks, I can deal with chaos because obviously there'll be a bunch of dead people I can resurrect. Let them fight Sigmar, wear him out. I'll strike down Sigmar and then I'll take out chaos. Kind of pitting the 2 dogs against one another. Problem was, he didn't account for how powerful chaos is and how just insidious it is. So, hole opens up, chaos pours in. Sigmar is so mad, he goes, instead of dealing with the chaos thing, he goes and hunts down Nagash. Isn't able to find him, or at least defeat him. Has to turn his attention back to the mortal realms. This is kind of where we get to the point where Sigmar is about to lock the gates and kind of seal himself up, because he's realizing this is just a losing fight. At this point, Archaon, the Ever-Chosen, shows up in the realm of death and is actually able to defeat Nagash in battle. I imagine this is super humbling, and so this is why when the Age of Sigmar books first came out, they referenced Nagash being in his kind of like healing state. He's like recuperating. It's because he got struck down by Archaon in a big way. Now, we did have a few books where some Hallowed Knights went into the Realm of Death and they were able to encounter Nagash. He basically just wiped the floor with them. He's incredibly powerful as just a powerhouse, a deity, ruler of the entire realm, and so they didn't stand a chance at all. But they have established that he is very, very much opposed to the Pantheon and joining it again, unlike Alariel, for example. Now, it's also important to note that Nagash is livid with Sigmar for multiple reasons. One, because he thinks Sigmar is arrogant and is a terrible leader. The other one is that what he does with the Stormcast Eternals is so against Nagash. So it's kind of crazy to think. Everyone who dies across the vastness of all mortal realms, their death energy goes to Nagash, making him kind of somewhat like almost as ubiquitous as a chaos god. By this I mean like Khorne. Anytime someone punches somebody else, Khorne gets stronger, right? Anytime anyone dies, no matter who's killing them, Nagash gets stronger. And so all this bloodshed and stuff like that, Nagash should be at an all-time high. However, something's happening to keep some of the heroic, the strongest, the best souls away from him, and that's Sigmar taking up these heroes. And every time a Stormcast Eternal dies, Nagash claws at the soul. He wants it so badly, but Sigmar pulls it away. One of the things that we are introduced to very early with the book series in the Realmgate Wars, one of the Lord Relictors, who are kind of like the spiritual, guidance, mentors, leaders of the Stormcast Eternals, they have frequent visions of Nagash calling out to them, reminding them that there's like a debt to be paid and you owe me and you don't belong there. Kind of these like very incriminating things. He is jealous for their souls, and that's incredibly interesting. When we talked about Stormcast Eternals and the cost of immortality and identity and stuff like that, Nagash is the one who's clawing away at their identity because they belong to him. And really that's where he's at right now, and they haven't dove too much into the Realm of Death yet. I really hope in this coming year, 2018, they will. But for now, he's popped up a few times in the stories, mostly through Neferata and Manfred. But yeah, I really hope to see more of him. But now I want to focus on why he matters. And truthfully speaking, there's a lot of reasons why he matters. One of it is just he's simply one of the god of the mortal realms. I mean, just like we spent several books talking about Alariel and like finding her, resurrecting her, helping her take her realm back, he is just as powerful as her, if not more so, because people are always dying. So he fits into that pantheon of just incredibly important people. And actually he has a model, which actually sets him apart from most of them. Him and Alariel are really the big two. Another super important thing to talk about him is he has driven so many events in the mortal realm's history. Just as a quick, resume, he invented, using necromancy on an army-wide level. He created through inaction of his own the Soul Blight. He refined and perfected necromancy where there are necromancers around now. He created and then subsequently destroyed the Tomb Kings. Became the god of death itself, and there's just a lot going on. The guy has a pretty impressive resume to back up his words. And as I said earlier, he is a driving factor behind the lore of the Stormcast Eternals, who are of course the main focus of a lot of the Black Library literature. That he is the shadow that kind of casts over them, right? They might seem perfect, they might seem amazing and good at everything like GW poster boys always do, but he is the thing that they fear because, rightfully speaking, they belong to him. Their souls are forfeit to him. There's a debt. And at some point, I really hope in the story, he's going to call in that debt. Now, and not just with Stormcast, though, he actually has, a very interesting dynamic with a lot of his followers. A lot of the other death races and factions are not particularly fond of him. He's a very divisive character, even within his own realm. It's not like in the realm of life, like there's no one who doesn't love Alariel, obviously except for chaos stuff, but I mean like in terms of like the natural things that grew there. But in the realm of death, you have vampire clans who are very torn about him. You have Flesh Eater courts. In their book, they made it very clear. Some Flesh Eater court, covens or whatever you want to describe them, see Nagash as like a golden god and he's amazing and we all love him, and some of them see him as like this ultimate evil and brought him to where they are. So it's very divisive, and I love that. it gets super boring when everyone is just all about their team. You get like, there's no orc who doesn't love Gorkamorka, right? I mean, there's no stormcast journal who doesn't revere Sigmar, no tree who doesn't love Alariel, but there are vampires and ghouls and all kinds of stuff that just revile Nagash. And you know what? In the last lore video, I brought stormcast journals down to a big idea, right? My core concept. And that one, it was identity. That they are the main thing that makes that army interesting is how they relate to the word identity and how it affects them. Well, here's my big idea for Nagash. It's not a single word one, unfortunately. I couldn't figure it out. But this concept that I really enjoy, and that is, above all, Nagash fights for order, but it has to be his. Okay, so to kind of unpack that a little bit, in the end times, it was very much order versus chaos, right? All the guys who would normally be killing each other got together because they represent order, and then obviously the chaos gods are always chaos. So Nagash is an order faction. I mean, in and of himself, he wants order. He wants absolute uniformity. The problem is his uniformity is under his control, which puts him in a really cool position because this gives him reasons why he would fight with order factions. It also gives him reasons why he obviously would fight with chaos. There is a certain point at which all order armies and death want the same thing, but then once the enemy is conquered, all of a sudden they want different things because the death guys want full control over the order stuff. So you can create some cool thematic alliances. It just fits. I love the fact that death, if you're kind of like on a spectrum of, say, order on the left, chaos on the right, that death and destruction kind of fit somewhere in that kind of variable where they can work for both. Obviously, everyone really hates chaos, but they have very mixed emotions when it comes to fighting for order because some of them really want that control. It's just a selfish version of it. And what makes that awesome is that this makes Nagash specifically a very complex character, right? He not only is complex in the sense that he has ultimate power, ultimate authority within his realm. He tries to exert it. He wants, from his perspective, good order things for the realms. It's just that everyone else disagrees with him. But not only that, he has the power and the history that have shaped events and made it the way it is. And for all of that, Nagash is one of the coolest characters in the Mortal Realms. He's powerful, he's in charge, he knows what he wants, he knows how to get it, he can manipulate things. I love the fact that there's so much strife within his own faction. He's kind of like the leader of a whole rabble of just murderers and crazy people, but he can get things done for his own benefit. And that, friends, is my review of Nagash, Lord of the Undead, in the Mortal Realms. Now, if you have a lore character or faction you want to learn more about, leave in the comments down below. Like I said earlier, I read every single comment and use all of them for inspiration. I try to get to as many as I can, although time permits me a little bit more. But above all, I'm just so glad you spent some time with me today. Thank you so much, and happy wargaming.